All right, so today I have a little surprise for you at the end of the chapter, and just wanted to let you know I recorded this video in two parts, which is why my appearance and the lighting changes throughout the video. But where these are book readings, they're not really meant to be watched anyways. So if you're just listening and not watching, you probably won't even notice. Let's just go ahead and get right into today's chapter. Chapter 15. There were no undertakers, but the Relief Society sisters did their best to make Will's body as presentable as possible. Gently, they worked the torn scalp back into place over the side and top of the head, hiding as best they could the jagged wound made by the grappling hooks. They clothed him in the outfit he had worn at his wedding. The two $20 gold pieces, his entire wage during his absence, seemed to vanish all too soon. There was the casket, the burial plot, and other things that had to be paid for. In her condition, it would be better if they kept the casket closed. Remember him as you last saw him, pleaded her mother and Mrs. Moore. I will see him, she exclaimed, and I want his body brought here to our home and the funeral procession to proceed from here for the service. And so it was, for none could dissuade her. The casket was a plain pine box, lined on the inside with a white, satiny material, and on the outside with a chalky white, embossed type of coarse velvet, used on caskets at that time by most pioneers. She insisted on the nickel-plated handles, far more expensive than her purse allowed. Will must have the best, she insisted. There was no stand on which to place the casket, so they used two chairs facing each other, so that the head rested on the one and the foot on the other, with an empty space between the two chairs. Sarah wore a borrowed black loose-fitting dress for the funeral. She then had no black one of her own. Later, she made herself two black dresses and wore them for cleanup and best. During the 2 years of mourning she set for herself in honor and respect for her beloved husband. When they had placed the casket on the two chairs, she turned to those in the room. Thank you all for being so kind to me, she said. Now may I ask you all to leave me alone with my husband for our last goodbye. Bishop, would you please remove the lid before you go? Something in her voice and manner forced them to obey, and the door closed behind the bishop as he stepped outside, leaving Sarah alone with her dead. The child within her moved uneasily, but she was unconscious of all except the figure lying so still and so unnatural in appearance before her. There were no tears. She had steeled herself for this moment. She knew they had to drag the river for his body. She looked down at the cold, dead face, as the throbbing ache in her throat seemed suddenly to all but choke her. It's not Will, her heart sobbed. But it is, prompted her mind, as her eyes rested on his beautiful auburn hair, and she stretched forth her hand to stroke it one last time. It seemed that they hadn't combed it just right somehow. Then, as she attempted to fix it, as he always wore it, her fingers pressed against the scalp. It slipped back from her terrified grasp, from what had been meant as a last caress. She sank choking to the floor, and her body slid down between the two chairs without upsetting the casket. The door opened, and Mrs. Moore, followed by Martha, entered. Sarah had not actually lost consciousness, but the shock had been too much. They helped her to her feet, and the funeral and burial were concluded without further incident. On their way back to the cabin, Mrs. Moore tried to comfort Sarah. None of what you are saying can comfort me now, dear friend. I have lost my Will. He was my reason for living. He is gone, and now I am alone, came her answer. Then, seeing the stricken look on the widow's face, she added, Someday, sometime maybe, but not now. My life is broken. I am alone and desolate. Sarah, you must not talk like that. Her words were almost a command. Think of your child, Will's child. You are not the only one who has been called upon to sacrifice and suffer. So many Mormon pioneers have known much pain and suffering, but they forged ahead. That is what you must do. We all love you, and we'll help you all we can. Right now you are going through the fiery furnace of God's testing, but it will work for the refining of your soul, I know. For I have seen you grow from a child bride, barely 15, to a wife, now a widow, very soon to be a mother. Adding after a pause, you have a great destiny before you, and I want to live to see it fulfilled. Sarah clung to her little cabin home for another 10 days, hoping and praying that Will would come back to her, there in a dream perhaps, but he never did. She moved back with her mother for lack of funds to stay longer. Her child was born the 4th of September, 1856. The winter was a hard, cold, very severe one for the pioneers that year. She finally had to sell her precious little stove with the oven her father had made for her, that they might buy food. She cared lovingly for her infant son, who she named William Gill Oakton. She called him Will. He was a strong, healthy child and thrived on the breastfeeding from his mother. She sewed for herself, her mother, Carrie, and helped with the sewing her mother took in, and did all possible to help. No one ever saw her cry, but her eyes and countenance wore a look of sadness that seemed stamped there forever. She was never idle. Even during little Will's nursing time, she read from her Book of Mormon or another of the few books available. Over 80 years later, when she lived with her granddaughter for a year, who cared for her, she said, "The love I had for Will has never left me. There are many kinds of love, but few, very few on this earth, ever had what we had. I know that. He never spoke a cross word to me. He was full of kindness, understanding, and, oh, such great love." Then, as the memories flooded back, the long-delayed tears, so long repressed, coursed down her withered, quivering cheeks and fell unheeded onto her bosom. "But I always knew there'd never be another like him. Never." Charles was ill for many days and was unable to attend the funeral. Then he left town without seeing Sarah. Phil came to help her pack her things and move back to her mother's. As he settled the last box onto the wagon he had borrowed, he turned suddenly to Sarah and said, "Sarah, I know this is neither the time nor place for me to say this to you, but I must say it. Please, Sarah, marry me, and let me take care of you and the child. I know you don't love me, but you might learn to care after a while. I want to do it for Will's sake, and also because I have always loved you. Ever since we first met and you danced with me, I was a boy then. I feel Will would like me to take care of you. I'll be so good to you. I'll try in every way to make you happy." The set, mask-like expression on her face was suddenly replaced by a soft, gentle half-smile. "Oh, Phil, how dear of you to ask me. I feel most honored, for I know you mean only to be kind. But I don't think I'll ever be able to marry anyone ever again. You understand, I know you do. It is a great honor you have paid me this day, and I shall always remember it." They drove to her mother's house in silence. Phil unloaded the wagon. Then turning to Sarah, he held out his hand, voice trembling, and said, "I do understand, dear Sarah, and I want you to know if you ever need a friend or are in need, you will call on me. Goodbye now. I must be off, but I'll be back if you need me." He's such a dear boy, she thought, as she worked through the mass of belongings piled in the center of her mother's big room. Though he was 3 or 4 years older than she still thought of him as Will's little brother. Martha worked 4 days a week at different homes sewing. There were only a few who could afford to hire at any price, but she worked for anything she could get: cornmeal, molasses, soap, leftover materials to sew, but very little money. She took little Carrie with her and trained her to play by herself with her rag doll, perhaps in a corner of the room where her mother worked. She was gone when Sarah arrived with her belongings. Gradually, as time elapsed, the shock of Will's death became less sharp. Now, as she turned back into the room after Phil's departure, she realized she was not a real part of this household any longer. She must learn to make it on her own. "I must find work," she thought. "Anything. Like her mother, she could create exquisite handwork, embroider, tatting, crocheting, lacework. But who could buy such things here, where everyone struggled just to exist? That evening when Martha returned, they talked it over with Mrs. Moore and Mary Alice to make what suggestions they might think useful. My baby is 6 weeks old now. I am well and strong, and I want to find work. They all sat silent, looking from one to the other. Best way I know, offered Mrs. Moore, is to ask the bishop if he knows of anyone who needs help in the home. I see him almost every day, and I'll ask him if you like. Yes, answered Sarah, before her mother could object. I wish you would. But the baby, what will you do with him? Cried Martha. Take him with me, as you do Carrie, came the quick reply. Tell him I'll do anything. 3 evenings later, the bishop came to say, I have found work for you, Sarah, if you can stand it, but you are so young. Here, bishop, sit down and tell us about it, said Martha, offering him a chair. He was such a kindly man, in his middle 50s, but looked much older. He took his responsibilities very seriously. He spoke softly so as not to disturb the sleeping child on the cot. I don't think you know this family. They live out in the southeast part of town, about 2 miles from here. Name of Sims. He has a farm, a wife, and 6 children. His wife is expecting. They've just called him on a mission to England. They need someone who can go there and stay night and day, help with the work, inside and out. Oh, Sarah, I don't know. When does he leave? Asked Sarah. Sarah, you can't even think of taking on a great job like that, from her mother. Bishop, I will go and talk with them tomorrow. Just tell me how to find the place. He leaves in about 2 weeks. The oldest boy is 14 and a good worker. He'll take care of most of the outside work. I will find someone who will give you a ride out to his farm if you're really interested. I am, and I can walk if necessary. What's 2 miles anyway? Oh, Sarah, you don't know what you're letting yourself in for. And another baby on the way. I'm well and strong, and I need the work. She paused. I know the work will be hard, but I must look into it just the same. If it's beyond what I think I can do, I'll know when I see them and the farm. Tim Jones is going out that way tomorrow, I just remembered, exclaimed the bishop, with a load of cedar posts. He'll be glad to have someone to talk to, so you be ready at 7 sharp in the morning, and I'll see that he takes you. I'll be ready. Thank you, Bishop, so much for all your trouble in helping me. I'm surely grateful to you. Glad to do it. No trouble at all. It's my duty and pleasure for those who need my help. You know, Sarah, you'll be in a different ward if you take this job. Yes, I know. Yes, I know. But you have been so good to me. I shall always love you and be grateful. You are such a good man. I appreciate you with all my heart. For now, I must find work. We all know that. Tim Jones dropped Sarah off at the Sims farm about 7:30 the next morning with a promise to stop for her when he returned from delivering his load. She thanked him and walked through the sagging gate, pausing as she scanned the scene before her. The barn looked fairly new and in excellent condition, even larger than the house, which sat far back from the road. It had 3 rooms and a large attic or loft, which served as a bedroom for the children. She noticed 4 youngsters in the yard long before they were aware of her. The barn was not far from the house. Stretching south and east were the acres of hay and grain, which were the main crops. To the west was a fenced-in pasture or meadow with a lovely stream of water running westward, either from springs above or the canyon. She couldn't tell which. 2 Jersey cows and a half-grown heifer calf were grazing near the stream, while 2 horses were trotting close to the fence line, as though for the sheer joy of living. Then the door of the house opened, and a tall, angular boy in his teens emerged. He was the first to notice Sarah. He hurried forward with, "I'll bet you're the new girl our bishop said might come work for us. I'm Jonathan, and I'm 14, going on 15, the oldest. What's your name?" Sarah looked into his large gray eyes that smiled straight into her own. She liked him immediately. He was barefoot, with faded bluish-gray trousers, and a shirt cut off at the elbows, all very clean, but very worn, near threadbare in spots. "Sarah is my name," she answered. The 2 other children were quick to gather round her. James, aged 12, David 10, Alberta, Bertie for short, aged 6. She noted how clean these children were, though their clothing was worn and faded from repeated washings. They all crowded round her, eager to be noticed and heard. They had reached the house. Jonathan opened the door and called, "Ma, the new girl is here. Her name is Sarah. I'll go get Pa." Sarah looked around the large kitchen, which also served as a living room. One side was curtained off for a bedroom. The large table in the center of the room was covered with the unwashed breakfast dishes. A long bench, backless on either side of the table, served instead of chairs. 2 chairs placed one at each end of the table, and a cook stove in the west end of the room completed the furnishings. The corner of the curtain moved, and a woman carrying a 2-year-old child emerged. She was of medium height and build, in her 7th month of pregnancy. She, too, was clean clothed in a worn, faded dress. Her hair was a slate color, neither brown nor black, parted in the middle, combed straight back to form a twisted knot at the nape of her neck. She set the child down and came toward Sarah. "I'm Bertha Sims," she said. "I'm glad you've come. I hope you'll like us and will stay. I can tell by looking at you that you'd fit in here. You will have to work hard, but don't we all? I must know more about what is expected of me. What I'm expected to do, ma'am. I don't know how much you know about me, but I'm a widow, and I have a 2-month-old son. This means I have to work, but it also means I must have my baby with me and care for him too." The door opened, and Elmer Sims entered. He was the developed replica of his son Jonathan, but with sterner features and a rather calculating look in his eye. A rather straggly beard and mustache. His long bony arms protruded past the sleeve, exposing hairy wrists and hands. His piercing gaze swept over Sarah, noting her build, dress, and features. He missed nothing. "Well, well, so you're the young lady. Do you think you can handle the farm work here and the house, miss?" Sarah caught the note of his skepticism. "I am Mrs., not Miss," she answered, "and I know how to work, but I don't promise to do the work of 2 people, if that's what you mean. I'll earn my way, you can depend on that, but I haven't accepted the job yet, nor have you hired me. We must talk first. I know what's expected of me. My name is Mrs. Sarah Oakton. My husband is dead. I have an infant son." "You don't say! Here I took you for a young filly," half laughing, half serious. "Well, now you know." He admired her spirit. She stood her ground, made for good character. Turning to the children, he said, "James, take the kids and look after them till I call you." As the door closed behind them, "Now, Mrs. Sarah Oakton, please come and sit down, and we 3 will talk business. As you know, I've been called on a mission to England. I must leave in about 2 weeks. My wife is expecting. We have 6 children now. The boys, Jonathan and James, are good workers and can do most of the farm work, except haying and grain cutting. The bishop has promised he'll see that the help will be given them. Your work will mostly be inside, housework, all that sort of thing. Do you think you can handle all that?" "I don't know, but I'll try. But first, what are the wages?" "Your board and keep, and you say you have a child? Well, we didn't count on that, but I will pay you 25 cents a week, and if you prove to be satisfactory and stay until I return, I will give you a heifer calf 6 months old." Sarah looked down at her hands, tightly clasped in her lap, trying to think, to decide. But she knew there was no alternative, no other work whereby she could feed herself and baby. She had hoped at least 50 cents a week, but knew it was because of the child. There was a long silence as she sat motionless, their eyes upon her, waiting. Mrs. Sims finally broke the silence. "Please, Sarah, we'd really like to have you, and we have to get someone right away, as you can see." "I'll take the job, and I'll do the best I can," she answered. "We'll send Jonathan with the horse and cart to fetch you and your belongings the day I have to leave." Now rising, "I must get back to work," adding as he reached the door, "Glad you're going to help us out. My wife needs help now, and will need it even more later on." "How will you get back to town?" asked Mrs. Sims. "Brother Jones, the man who brought me, said he'd call back for me." Sarah rose as she spoke, adding, "I may as well help you what I can till he comes," as she began gathering up the breakfast dishes. Mrs. Sims heaved a sigh of relief. I like her, she thought. I like her a lot. More all the time. It was near 2 p.m. when Sarah stepped down from the Joneses' wagon as he stopped to let her out in front of her mother's home. Thank you so much, she said gratefully. Glad to have you along. 'Twas no trouble at all, as he drove on. As she opened the door, she could hear the wail of her babe. Thank goodness you're back, exclaimed her mother. This child is half starved. How did things go? It's the longest he's gone without feeding, she answered, as she gathered him to her and gave him his nourishment straight from the fountain of nature. There were no easy ways of artificial feeding in those days. If for some reason a mother could not nurse her child, they tried to find a nursing mother who would help out. If all this failed, they were forced to feed the child with a teaspoon of diluted milk. Many infants thus died in early infancy from indigestion and even infection. What a picture she made, thought Martha, head bowed slightly over the nursing infant. You're all I have in the world, Sarah whispered to her child. That's a part of me and a part of Will. I'll take care of you, and we will find happiness together. Martha repeated her question. Are you going to tell me what happened? Yes, I have decided to take the job, and we'll begin in about 2 weeks. They'll send for me the day Mr. Sims leaves. They seem like nice people, far from well-to-do, but not as poor as we are. They'll give me board and keep and 25 cents a week. 25 cents a week? Why, that's... But Sarah interrupted her. It's because of the child. They hadn't counted on that. He also promises me a 6-month-old heifer calf if I can stay the full time. Martha sank back in her chair. He's just a baby, she sighed. Yes, I know. But they know I'll have to care for him as well as their work. Besides, by next year, he'll need food from the farm, another mouth to feed. I must take it. There's nothing else. You know that. There was a tap on the door and Mrs. Moore stepped inside. Hope you haven't had lunch. I've brought you a piece of molasses cake. Mary Alice has gone to help the Wisemans for the day, so we can have a cup of mint tea with it. And this half of baked sage hen, my pay from the pits. No, from Sarah. I just realized I'm half starved. I really had an ulterior motive, you know. I'm most anxious to hear what you decided about the job. I'm going to take it. She gave the details as they ate their lunch. Have you told her that Charles is in town, Martha? Haven't had a chance, but he is, and he's here to see you, Sarah. Said he'd be back later. Both women watched for her reaction, but she remained calm. Oh, she said, he's got a present for you from Mrs. Moore. I must be getting home. Sarah stretched out on the cot after she left. Little Will roused her some time later with cries for more food. As she prepared him for bed and fed him, she whispered, You need a crib, but I don't know how I'll get one. Soon you'll be able to roll off the bed. You're growing so fast. Then what'll I do? I just don't know. She brushed out her hair and braided it into one long rope and let it hang down her back. It felt good to be rid of the pins and the weight on her head. Martha undid the package she had brought home with her. I took the braided rug I finished to Mrs. Jenner this morning. She paid me in food. We'll have cornmeal mush for supper with milk on it. There'll be enough for tomorrow, too. She's been really generous this time. It was after dark when Charles's knock came. You go, Mother, from Sarah as they heard his knock. Then there he stood, so much like Will, yet not Will at all. An icy chill shot through her frame. It was the first time she had seen him since the tragedy, but she mustered her emotions and seemed outwardly calm. Come in, Charles. Martha was being extra cordial. After all, he was a good friend, and he cared a great deal for Sarah. Charles was neither bashful nor shy. He had come to see Sarah and said so. I've brought something for you, or should I say for my nephew. It's just out the door. If you'll hold it open, I'll fetch it. As he spoke, he stepped outside to return with what appeared to be a huge red blanket woven by the Indians, with a black and white design running through it. Both women gasped. Sarah thought she had never seen one half so large. With both hands, he lifted it onto the table and began untying the rope that bound it. There was something hard inside the folds. She watched his strong, tanned fingers as they untied the rope and drew out what appeared to be a beautifully woven something or other made from dried reeds, resembling raffia. What was it? There was more than the mat and woven reeds. He took hold of the center round metal ring and lifted the whole thing out from the blanket past the table, where it slipped down onto the floor, woven ropes attached to each corner and leading back to the center ring. There stood the most beautiful hand-woven oval basket large enough to bed a child of a year or more, with staff-like legs at all four corners. "You see," he said, "you can hang it from a tree branch or from a low ceiling, or you can stand it beside the bed. It works either way." Then turning back to the table, he picked up the blanket, shook it out, and held it toward Sarah. "This is for you." As he spoke, he stepped behind her, gently draping it across her shoulders. It completely covered her from neck to the floor. She lifted her eyes to his at last. They were blinded with tears, and her lips trembled as she murmured, "Oh, Charles, the basket, cradle, how wonderful, and the lovely blanket. I do thank you with all my heart." Martha was running her fingers over the woven part of the basket, emitting little ohs and ahs as she realized the need it would fill. Charles was fighting to keep calm. Never had she seemed more desirable to him than at this moment. Eyes misty with tears, and that firm mouth, almost smiling at him with real tenderness. He longed to take her then and there and declare his love for her, his need, his desire. But he knew he must be careful. He had lost her once. He did not intend to do so again. "Come," he said, "get a shawl. This is too warm for you. It's for winter." As he lifted the blanket from her and folded it, placing it on the table, "Let's go for a walk." He saw her hesitate, yet how could she refuse? It would seem so ungrateful. She took up her wrap, and they stepped out into the night together. He reached for her hand in the darkness, but withdrew it before he touched her. He spoke at last, softly, yet with such intensity that she sensed his emotion. "Sarah, I've come back to marry you before some dang polygamist grabs you." He felt her stiffen as his arm encircled her. She turned and faced him. "Charles, I think I like you better than any other man alive, but I cannot marry you, not now." "And why not?" "You know as well as I do, the custom is to wait for 1 year before a person remarries when a loved one is taken. But Will was no ordinary man. I loved him beyond anything I can ever explain to you. I intended to mourn for him for at least 2 years, not just 1. If you are willing to wait for me for the 2 years, then I will be your wife. Next to him, I believe I could come to love you, but I owe it to him to wait that long." "You can't mean that. You can't." He had stopped and pulled her to him. "I want you now. I've waited over 3 years for you, and you ask me to wait 2 more? I love you, please," he pleaded as he crushed her to him. His lips found hers, and he kissed her as he had never dared to before. For now he felt she belonged to him. He had the right. He would make her love him. She ceased to struggle, but her body stiffened. He relaxed his suffocating hold and gently laid his cheek against hers. "Please, little Sarah, all I want to do is take care of you. I can make you happy. I know I can. I won't stand by and watch you become a farm laborer and a kitchen maid, a slave perhaps. Yes, your mother told me you were considering just that. You know about that, do you? I have accepted the job, Charles. I won't have it. There is no need. If you marry me right away, we will get a place of our own, and I will take care of you and the boy." I can't. I will mourn for my Will for 2 years first. We both owe him that much respect and love. Deep down, I believe you know it too. I have learned one thing since loving Will, and that is that love is a giving thing, not a taking one. I gave all my love to him, and he to me, yet now he is gone. I realize that someday I may marry again, but never will I know the kind of love again that we had for each other. You are nearest of all, but we must wait, as I have said. You aren't doing him one bit of good by waiting, and you are punishing me and yourself and the child. He needs more than you can earn and give. You know that. I'm sorry you feel that way, but I can't go against what I know is right." "Right? Heck, I'll bet that long before those precious 2 years are up, you'll be 3rd, 4th, or 5th wife of some man twice your age. You'll learn then what real work is, for you'll have to help wait on the other wives too." "Never, never will I do that," she exclaimed. "Come," he said, taking her arm. "I will take you back home." There was anguish mingled with despair in his voice. "Oh, Charles, please don't go away angry. Just help me to do the right thing, and then we'll never have any regrets, and we may be happy at last." He did not answer, but turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone on the step of her mother's house. She turned and entered quietly. Martha was dozing in her chair with only a candle burning. She roused as Sarah entered. "Where's Charles?" she asked. "Gone. I sent him away. He wants to marry me now, without waiting. I can't do that. He was determined and then angry, but I can't marry this soon, no matter what." "Sarah, surely you realize that circumstances alter cases. In this case—" "You too, Mother?" There was a sob in her voice. "I hoped you'd understand. Father would have. I know he would." She sank down on the cot and began to undress. "I do understand, but there are more things here to consider than sentiment. Winter is coming. Fuel is scarce. So is food. He loves you and would be good to you and to little Will. He is the child's closest relative. Some men don't want a woman with a child. You are just making your life far more difficult because of a few months' time. Sarah, I only want what's best for you. I can't sell myself for a few months' board and keep to any man, not even Charles. I have not refused him, just asked him for more time. I thought he'd feel the same way out of respect for Will, but he doesn't. He thinks only of the now and what he wants. You don't know him like I do. He looks like Will, but their natures are very different in every way. He's quick-tempered and when crossed can be very angry and cruel. Besides, I have a job. I've given my word. They depend on me. I can take care of myself, and I intend to do so, in the way I know is right for me." "Will he be back tomorrow?" "No, I don't think so. He knows I won't change my mind." "Well, we may as well go to bed. Big day's work tomorrow. I've a quilt to finish for Mrs. Abrams, and must go to the tithing settlement and see the bishop. I'm tired, too. Good night, Mother." She slid into bed as Martha blew out the candle, but sleep would not come. Oh, what a day it had been. The trip to the farm, the Sims family, all those children. Then Charles. His gifts, and then his surprise proposal. His anger and sudden departure after her refusal. But he would be even more hurt if she refused his gifts. She gathered her babe and fed him, letting the tears fall unnoticed. "I did what I had to do," she murmured against the warm head of her tiny son. Martha was back from the tithing office before noon with an armload of supplies the bishop had insisted she take, knowing their need at this time. "Come see what I've got," she exclaimed as she unwrapped the bundle, which was wrapped in a faded warm blanket. "He told me to go through the clothing, and there was this old wool blanket. Minute I saw it, I knew it'd be just the thing to line the new crib for little Will. Oh, Mother, it's perfect. Big enough to make several thickness, like a little bed. Yes, I knew you'd like it. And here are some potatoes. We can have baked potatoes tonight." There were a few other staples. They sorted through them together. "I found some dandelion greens and some pigweeds, aka wild spinach. For lunch we can make cornmeal pancakes instead of mush, with mint tea. We're out of milk anyway," said Sarah. They spent the rest of the day padding and lining the crib. It was surprisingly beautiful when finished. They were both experts, and they spared no pains in this task. When it was finished, Sarah picked up little Will and gently transferred him into his new sleeping quarters. "There, darling, you have a bed of your own now." She spent the next 2 weeks getting things in readiness for her transfer to her new job, sewing, mending, sorting things for herself and child. She had so few clothes for herself and the child that she had to keep them up from day to day, for the most part. She helped her mother with sewing brought home and quilting and binding of quilts, all by hand, when needed. Mrs. Moore and Mary Alice came to see her one day while Martha was away. As they sat visiting, Mary Alice said, "Charles left the next morning after seeing you, Sarah. All he said was that you wouldn't marry him now. He seemed very upset. Didn't say where he was going or when he'd be back." We thought it was best not to question him. We thought it was best not to question him, put in Mrs. Moore. So we are sort of in the dark. I told him I would mourn for Will for 2 years, but that if he still wanted me then, I'd marry him. I know this upset him, but it's the way I feel and the way that I am. I thought he'd feel the same way about his own brother, but he didn't. He was furious with me that I wouldn't change my mind, but that's the way it is. Did he show you the little crib and the lovely blanket he brought me? We saw the blanket all wrapped up, nothing else. He didn't explain. Come and see, exclaimed Sarah, rising and taking each by the hand, led them to where little Will lay sleeping in the crib which stood between 2 suspended rods, rocking back and forth as a cradle, or could hang quietly. Oh, they both gasped under their breath, so as not to waken the child. He did mumble something about having a present for you. Said it was made by an Indian woman. We thought it was the blanket. Yes, that too. It's a beauty, prettiest one I've ever seen. From the corner of her cot, she picked up the blanket and displayed it. Poor Charles. I can't help feeling sorry for him, said Mary Alice. But I understand your feelings, Sarah. Guess I'm caught between the two. Yes, I know, but I did not refuse him. I only asked him to wait. Charles is so impatient and feels he's waited long enough, said Mrs. Moore. It might be different if they were not brothers, but I feel we both owe Will that much respect. If that's the way you feel, that's the way it should be, said Mrs. Moore. They left soon afterward. And that's it for today's chapter. I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments. What do you think about this additional marriage proposal? Do you agree with how Sarah handled that? What would you do if you were in her shoes? And were you expecting to hear from Charles again? So, where do things go from here? And will we hear from Charles again? Stay tuned to find out. Okay, so now for my surprise. I was going to wait and save this for the documentary, but I couldn't resist, so here we are. So while researching these ancestors that we're reading about in this book for the documentary that I'm going to do at the end of the chapter readings, I came to learn that Will does not have a headstone. I actually went to the cemetery and I visited the spot where he was buried. He's buried in the Salt Lake Cemetery, and it's actually right by President Monson's grave. Pretty awesome. And he's all alone. He's not with any family, and there's no headstone. Now, I get the feeling that all of these years, no one has ever visited him, and no one has ever remembered him because there's no headstone for him to be remembered. And up until this point, no one has ever told his story. Now, if you're wondering why he doesn't have a headstone and why might his family and descendants have never have known about him or visited his grave, you're going to find that out in the documentary. But when I learned that, I had compassion for Will, especially learning about the kind of person that he was and how he was Sarah's true love and how he is my great-great-great-grandfather. I felt that to really honor him and tell his story, that I would set up a GoFundMe campaign to fund a tombstone, a grave marker for Will. So anyone out there who has been following this story, if you would like to be a part of this, I put a link down below where you can donate, and I'm also sharing this with family and friends. And for those of you who do donate, I've decided to give away copies of this book. So if you would like to own a copy of this book, now just so you can see, this is how far we are through it. This is what we've read, this is what we have left to go, and a lot of this towards the end is that interview. That's pretty interesting, so I can't wait to get to that part. But I would love to give away some copies of this book to thank you for your contributions. So to read more about that, click on the link. And for those of you who do make a contribution, I'm also going to include your name with your permission for sure on his family search page under memories and also on findagrave.com. I was going to leave some flowers there and list all the names of those who made contributions to get him a headstone and was going to tell that story there. But also, if I can get enough donations in time for the documentary, I would like that to be the crowning jewel of the documentary. taking whatever contributions we can raise, designing that headstone, and placing it on his grave at the Salt Lake Cemetery. I would love for you to be a part of that experience. So for those of you who would like to make a contribution, you'll get to be a part of that. Your name will become a part of history as a contributor for his headstone. And you will also receive a copy of this book. So go ahead and click on that link. Comment below if you have any questions. I'm excited to see what happens with this. So stay tuned, and I will see you next week for Chapter 16.